Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. A pro-migrant charity group calling itself Are You Serious has released a video coming out from Bosnia and a detention center where refugees, some as young as 3, have been held in cages. Bosnian authorities have denied that these are inhumane conditions, saying that these cages and detention centers have been set up according to EU and European standards. Let's discuss that situation a bit further, as well as all related issues to that. We're now joined by our esteemed panelists, Mr. Semir Mujkić, who is a journalist at the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network in Bosnia and Herzegovina, is joining us live now from Sarajevo. We're also joined by Dr. Nadan Petrovic, who is a professor of strategies of international cooperation at La Penzia University of Rome in Italy. He also has extensive experience vis-a-vis asylum issues. He is joining us now from Croatia. And we're also joined by Professor Christian Kaunert, who is a professor of policing and security, director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. He's joining us now from Cardiff. Christian, Nadan, and Semir, thank you all for joining us. Semir, I'll start with you. How did you react to this video?
Well, it was, to be honest, it was shocking to me to see so small spaces designated for people and for children, especially, without any beds, without any chairs. You only have floor and cages. I was truly shocked. It's something that you could see designed to. It's not nice to say, but these things look as if they were designed for animals, not for people. It's really not normal situation and not normal conditions. Even though the local authorities said that they only keep migrants and refugees here for a couple of hours, it's still not good enough explanation. I don't think that these types of accommodations should be existing at all. And it was quite shocking in Bosnia. We've been dealing with these crises for more than a year now, intensively, but this is something new and something shocking for Bosnia, especially. We always have to say it, that we have similar experiences more than 20 years ago, so it's really not something to expect.
We're going to go to Christian. Tell us about the claim by the Bosnian authorities that these cages still meet European standards. Do you believe that that is true?
Right. Well, thank you very much for calling me. No, this claim is absolutely not true. I mean, if refugees were held within the European Union, they would have to uphold minimum reception conditions that are set by the European Union. We are extremely far away. I mean, from the aspect of having been held, in a sense, captive in those detention centers, that is already very debatable, but the kind of conditions in which they were held captive is well below any kind of standards, and in fact may very well be illegal because of course, Bosnia is not a member of the European Union yet, but it is trying to approximate its legislation to European legislation. And on top of that, the European Convention on Human Rights standards also apply to Bosnia, and I'm seriously doubting whether those conditions would fulfill the European Convention on Human Rights.
What do you think the role of the rest of Europe is at this point? Some people pointing the fingers at Croatia and Hungary for not allowing in asylum seekers.
Yeah, that's what we are actually seeing at the Croatian border, seeing a lot of refugees being pushed back from the border in not so humane way. There are a lot of reports from them saying that they've been beaten, their phones being destroyed on the border. So it's really it's a sad thing to see at the border between these two countries. But again, we had almost 20,000 refugees last year, and almost all of them went through. So Croatia, as it seems to me now, is only trying to slow it down, not in a good way. but it seems that the refugees are still making it through the border. Now we have 6,000 new refugees in Bosnia, but this year is expected to be much higher, and the country, as Bosnia is complex and not so functional, is going to have a huge problems with this. As for this video and this report, I think it's something that it's really need to be acted fast on this, and there are institutions in Bosnia that should be discussing this and to not allow this behavior to ever repeat again. If you need to detain people, if you need to keep people, we have centers, we have other areas which are equipped much better than this. This is just not satisfactory. This should not be allowed ever to repeat again.
Christian, I wonder what you make of Croatia and Hungary's role in all of this. They would argue, obviously, even as EU members, that they need to protect national security, and they don't need to necessarily allow these people in or provide them asylum.
Well, I mean, there's two things here. If refugees have actually already entered the territory of a member state, for instance, Hungary or Croatia, at that point, under the Dublin Convention, they are actually obliged to assess their asylum claim if one is made. So have they reached the territory yet? Well, in that case, they have to process their application. If they haven't yet reached the territory, then they would be in the right to, in a sense, not push them back, but at least not allow them entry into the country, because, of course, you need to have a legal way of entering the country before you can make that asylum claim. Now, it is difficult to assess exactly what happened here, but I would imagine that given the amount of flows that were at some point going in particular towards Hungary, but of course also towards Croatia and so on, there's probably a certain leeway within what authorities were doing in terms of trying to push them back. I don't doubt that maybe even some people that have already entered the territory were kind of pushed back in a way. Now, if that happened, that wouldn't be allowable under European legislation. But just to deny entry, that would be possible, yes. And they would be in their right to do that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, Semir, one other big aspect to all of this, obviously, is the fact that Bosnia is one of the, if not the poorest European country. It is obviously not an EU member yet. I imagine, Semir, that Bosnian authorities could argue that, listen, we simply cannot take this sort of responsibility of all these refugees and asylum seekers on our shoulders.
Yes, that's something that we've seen through all these months, keeping the same narrative that we don't have enough money, not enough capacities, but that simply is not true. I truly believe and know through my journalistic work that we might not be able to provide everything that these people need, but we really could provide much more. More safety at first, and more food, and definitely better conditions and better accommodation. The problem is no one in Bosnia wants to deal with it. It doesn't bring any political points, and it's something that it's not popular to do, so they're not actually doing it. We have a problem with complex states since we have a lot of different levels of the government. So the state level, which should be dealing with this mostly, is just doesn't want to do as much as they should do, so they're just letting local authorities deal with it. Local authorities, of course, don't have enough resources and not enough money to deal with it. So we have a situation where everyone is saying this is not our responsibility, but in the end, I truly believe if the government is to organize, we could have enough money and enough capacities to give these people much more. The other problem is that this kind of system is not letting local people help as much as they could. It's still illegal to rent an apartment to refugees in Bosnia, and in many ways government did not help in getting help from the people and getting donations in money and in everything else. In most ways they were discouraging it. I truly believe that if the government is really decisive on resolving this situation with the help of local authorities and the citizens, it could be much better. That explanation that we don't have money and capacity is simply not true. That is also something that they've been using for everything else, not just for this crisis.
Yeah.
They keep telling that we don't have enough capacity, but if you look at the complex system, political system, and all administration, you really see that there is enough money.
Just before going into a break, Christian, I wanted to ask you very quickly, what do you make of the argument by many European countries? We've seen Italy make this argument and others that they're taking on too much load here. And I imagine Bosnia at some level could argue that as well, as even a non-EU member of Europe, essentially. Do you think that there is a fair argument to be made there about how much burden all of Europe should be taking on?
Yeah, I think we need to be a little bit careful to describe refugees as a burden. Of course, there are costs attached to it, and of course, that is weighs heavily on the public purse, but we need to be careful with the word burden. Now, in terms of distribution of whatever we might call the costs and the kind of work that is related to receiving refugees, there is, of course, an inherent unfairness within the Dublin system of the European Union, that the countries that are closer to the centers of the refugee flows, and Italy is one of them, but of course Spain, Greece, and a number of Mediterranean countries are others, they are inherently more vulnerable to receiving higher numbers, because the way the system works is that when you enter the European Union for the first time, that is the country where you have to make your asylum claim. So by definition, it's very difficult to enter the European Union from, let's say, Sweden or from Germany.
Yeah.
That is much more difficult unless you're taking a plane to those countries. So that gives a certain burden towards countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece.
Yeah.
However, it is also true to say that a lot of these refugees that enter those countries are immediately then moving on to, let's say, Germany, Sweden, Finland, and Scandinavian countries more generally. And there we see that this inherent unfairness within the system needs to be addressed. The Commission has tried to address it by redistributing refugees, but so far the system is not working yet. And I think that's where the European Union really needs to put a lot of emphasis on.
Okay, Christian, and that was a good burden. I didn't mean to use it with negative connotations, but you're completely right. We should be careful about using that word. Let's go into a short break now, viewers. We'll be back continuing this discussion, not just about the video, but about this entire issue of how migrants and asylum seekers are treated across Europe and, in fact, across the world. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. We're still with Semir and Christian, and Nadan is back with us, Nadan Petrovic, that is, who is an immigration and asylum expert joining us from Croatia in this half. Let me begin with Nadan himself. Nadan, I'd asked you earlier, before we got cut off, about Croatia's actions when it comes to asylum seekers, not allowing them in. What do you make of that?
Well, it is... It appears as a new emerging crisis. I mean, of course, Croatia, after the war in former Yugoslavia, faced for the very first time migrants and refugee problem, and in 2015, during the big migrant crisis. But afterwards, the numbers, as you know, have reduced very, very sharply in 2016 and 2017. Last year, that problem raised again, I mean, with probably new road created through Albania, Montenegro, and especially Bosnia and Herzegovina. and it poses a new challenge to Croatia as a European Union member state, because as you may be aware, Croatia is not yet part of the Schengen agreement, but wants to enter the Schengen agreement and try to apply in a very strict way EU rules, and EU rules are quite strict in refusing entrance of illegal migrants, and that is why irregular, let's say, migrants, and that is why there are several hotspots near Bosnian and Croatian border, especially Western Bosnia, that is concerned, that are a kind of hotspot in these last several months, especially last few days with the spring season.
Semir, I'm wondering, you had earlier, Semir, about the complex political situation within Bosnia itself, Semir. So I wonder, do you think that these sorts of refugees who come in and these asylum seekers, is that adding pressure on that system, which is existing again in very sensitive times?
It is for sure presented in that way, that this problem is a pressure on the system. But if you honestly look at the numbers and the rates, we only had in total, I think, around 25,000 people in Bosnia. That's really not a big number. It's not even comparable to numbers in the region. And you have Serbia, which is neighboring country, with much higher number. And there's no narrative now that it's making a pressure there. So I don't see why would it be in Bosnia. It is, though, used as a narrative for right-wing organizations and groups, and in some part even political parties. And due to the complex system, you have the entire government and political elite of Republic of Srpska saying we don't want any migrants in our territory. So they just, if they find any, they just take them to the nearest entity border, because Bosnia is divided into two entities. So it is presented that way, but in my true opinion, it really is not presenting that much pressure, because there are enough institutions and enough people to do it, especially with the help of international organizations. So I don't think it's putting pressure, but it is that narrative. It is presented in that way.
Okay, so Christian, I wanted to take this more global, because this issue of detention, and if I may hone in for a moment about children, because in this specific case, according to Are You Serious, the charity that released this video said that a child as young as 3 was held in one of these cages. This is not new, unfortunately, is it? When it came to the U.S., for example, we had migrant children being held at the Mexico-U.S. border as well. We've had such stories in other parts of the quote-unquote free world as well. What do you make of that, Christian, about this issue of how even migrant children are being treated in many of these spaces, and not just in poor countries like Bosnia?
Yes, unfortunately, this is an issue across the globe, really, because if we look at what standards we have, whether it's the European Convention on Human Rights, whether it's the Geneva Convention for refugees, all of those standards apply only to a certain number of countries, and a lot of them tend to be European. Some countries outside the European Union don't adhere to those standards, and unfortunately the United States, for instance, is one of those countries that also doesn't adhere to them. Australia is another country which often has been pointed at for maybe mistreating some of their refugees. It is unfortunately the case that what we need globally is really a global compact for refugees that every country in the world subscribes to. At this point, we do not have it. The Geneva Convention, global as it tries to be, does not contain every country in the world. And this is seriously lacking. And the points that you are pointing out, minors, 3 years old, in horrific kind of detention centers, that is something that as a human race we should not accept that something like that exists.
And Nadan, one of the issues that always, when we're talking about asylum seekers, is the root causes of why these people are seeking asylum to begin with. Do you think, Nadan, that Europe and the rest of the Western world, and the rest of the world really, is prepared to actually tackle the root causes of why these people are seeking asylum, leaving their countries where there is upheaval and chaos?
Of course, yes. Root causes, the reasons for arrivals of Europe are several one. I always tell that European Union border with a very huge area that goes basically from Pakistan to Nigeria, so Middle East and Northern Africa, from whom most of the countries in those two regions are immigration countries for both migrant and refugee causes. We have a very serious wars in the area of Syria, Afghanistan, etc., some very long-term conflicts, etc., and some other countries that are huge immigration countries. European Union last few years finally introduced these topics in its development policies. So some actions have started to be done in dialogue with those countries from immigration, etc., also including some migration and development components. We are at the early beginning of those policies. Those policies need decades and a lot of investments. Of course, it is as far as economic migration is concerned. But then we have serious conflicts. We have now very, very serious situation in Libya, of course, that may contribute to another flow. And then we have in the middle between these two categories a lot of people that are like climatic migrants or refugees. I mean, if you leave your village for those reasons, you are not really a refugee, but you are not really a person that wants to see the world and get a better job. You are a kind of forced anyway. So it is a very complex issue, but for the first time, I think European Union tried to address it. But we are at the early beginning of that.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate all times your insight and analysis. That was Nadan Petrovic, who is a professor of strategies of international cooperation at La Penzia University of Rome in Italy. He was speaking to us from Croatia. He also has vast experience when it comes to asylum issues and immigration issues. We were also joined by Mr. Semir Mujkić, who is a journalist at the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was speaking to us from Sarajevo. And we were also joined by Christian Kaunert, who is a professor of policing and security at the University of South Wales. He was speaking to us on the line from Cardiff in the UK. And now, viewers, as our guests all spoke about, certainly this video that has come out of these asylum seekers in those conditions, I should say, in those cages, is certainly something that is to be condemned. But it's not as simple as that always. It is also about the rest of Europe and how it is acting towards these refugees who are trying to seek safety from their own country's upheaval and chaos. Bosnia obviously would claim that it is one of the poorest countries in Europe, if not the poorest country in Europe, though it is not an EU member. It still gets aid from the rest of Europe many times. But does that excuse its actions? Does that excuse Croatia and Hungary and the far right move throughout Europe as well as the Western world? Because remember, even in the US, at the Mexico-US border, children have also been detained. We'll keep a close eye on this complex situation, how this develops going forward, but I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope. Now, 6 years after the Rana Plaza tragedy that took place in Bangladesh and the garment factory fire that led then to international safety monitoring in the country, campaigners are now warning of grim consequences if such oversight ends or is abandoned by the government. We're going to discuss this a bit further and the role of international brands in all of this, as well as, of course, Bangladesh's own government and Supreme Court's role in the fact that this oversight may very well be abandoned at this time. Let's discuss that further with our esteemed panelists. We're joined by Vanpeperstraete, who is with the Lobby and Advocacy Coordinator of the Clean Clothes Campaign. He's joining us now from Brussels in Belgium via Skype. We're also joined by Dr. Mubashar Hasan, who is a postdoctoral Doctoral Research Fellow at the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at Oslo University, is joining us now from the Norwegian capital. And we're also joined by Ms. Aruna Kashyap, who is joining us from India. She's a senior counsel for the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, which, as you know, is an international NGO, and she's worked extensively on garment workers' rights in many countries across Asia. Aruna, Mubashar, and Ben, thank you all for joining us. Ben, I'd like to start with you, and I wanted you to just reflect on 6 years after the Rana Plaza tragedy. Do you think that things are better now for garment workers?
Well, 6 years after Rana Plaza, I think we achieved a lot in Bangladesh. Our factories are notably safer. There's lots of safety risks that have been identified in factories, mainly through the international initiative called Bangladesh Accord. But at the same time, we also feel that lots still needs to be done, because there's still safety issues that have been identified in factories that need to be remediated in order to make those factories safe. So factories are safer, but factories also still need to go and travel a road to become more safer. At the same time, we see not as much progress on other issues, such as living wage and freedom of association. And we also think that there's much room for improvement on those fields as well.
Very well. Mubashar, what do you make of the 6 years later now, the Bangladesh government essentially saying it wants to take over this accord, this international oversight, saying that it can do a better job? What do you make of that, Mubashar?
I think there are some logic and politics behind this decision. Bangladesh government has been trying to minimize the brand image risk that has been created by the Rana Plaza incident. So at the same time, there are conflicting views coming out from the garment exporter who argue that the retail ban, the global retail ban, have not really increased the price of the product, and with this increasing safety, it needs cost. So the whole discussion, I think, is at the moment in limbo, and combined within the nature of the global political economy and the distribution of wealth in Bangladesh. And we need to wait and see how it ends.
It's a very good point, isn't it, Aruna? Because certainly the economics here are important, aren't they? It's not just Bangladesh's government which is responsible in this case, but all these international brands which obviously demand that costs are that much lower, ever so more, on a yearly basis when it comes to producing their products.
I think one of the radical changes that the Bangladesh Accord brought about, which was quite historic, is that it for the first time actually cast a responsibility very clearly on brands within the framework of a binding agreement to facilitate financing. And it's very unfortunate that the manufacturers are not able to take better advantage of that in a manner that actually holds brands accountable. I think there's a lot of creative maneuvering that can be done with costing tools and so on that are being introduced, and campaign groups that are supportive of better costs. I think everybody's quite aware that the duplicity of brands needs to be called out, that on the one hand that they're asking for better conditions, but on the other hand they want to drive down the prices. I don't think anybody disputes that. The question is, why are governments shooting themselves in the foot by harming their own workers? This is their own citizens. By not holding brands accountable. I mean, and they don't have to do anything. All they have to do is support other initiatives, and campaign groups that are coming in with interesting costing tools and ideas on how to improve costs and wages to operate in country. Instead, they sort of have all these restrictions on freedom of association and are pushing back against initiatives like the Accord. And going back to this, what is the government's role? I think, the challenge in countries like Bangladesh, where there is a huge regulatory gap, which is, there is a significant regulatory burden on the government. Yeah. And there's obviously the number of inspectors available, etc., needs to be bolstered up. And this is where initiatives like the Accord can actually help in. If they cooperated and put a good transitioning model together, it can be a win-win. But they're choosing not to make it a win-win right now, which is very, very unfortunate for the workers.
Ben, I wonder what you make of that, because obviously the government, I imagine, Ben, would argue that, listen, Bangladesh is a developing country and it needs, its image to remain positive when it comes to, having these brands have their garment factory set up in the country to provide its citizens work. Obviously, as Aruna there said, there are, obviously concerns about how its own citizens will be treated. But how does one balance that, Ben?
Well, but I think the Accord was really a response to help the Bangladeshi garment industry, because when Rana Plaza happened 6 years ago, Bangladesh as an export brand was a really tainted brand, like brands were threatening and concerned about the reputational risk that they would have from producing in Bangladesh. And a lot of brands were considering to pull back from Bangladesh. The Accord itself actually helped to counter that by saying to brands, no, you need to stay in Bangladesh, you need to take up your responsibility, and you need to be part of the solution by helping to fix it. So in that sense, the Accord actually helped to help Bangladesh to recover as an export brand. And we also see it in the figures. The export has grown. So in our analysis, the problem of the Accord is not as much a problem of reputational risk or anything. At the same time, I do agree with the two other speakers that obviously the brands, and that's what the Accord actually tries to do, are responsible for co-financing those remediation, and some of them are expensive. So this is, I think, a crucial element of the Bangladesh Accord. And I think it's also the only element of the Bangladesh Accord that is impossible to transfer to a national regulatory body. Notably, that commitment of brands to make sure that financing for remediation of necessary safety repairs are readily available.
Mubashar, do you think, Mubashar, that the Bangladesh government could do a better job?
I mean, it's kind of going, I can't really comment on that, because it will depend on fact-checking and other stuff. But I think the aim of the reason government is trying to assert its authority is that it's not a long-term solution for the local industry to have external influence. But at the same time, I think, as my co-speakers have argued, that the timing is not yet there. So it goes back to the point that a growing, ambitious nationalist government trying to assert a message that argues that we can take care of our safety. But again, the evidence are scarce, because recently there was a big fire in one of the old Dhaka city, and we haven't seen that much of good progress in terms of managing the fire and rescue and other stuff. So I think the best way for the government is to continue this discussion rather than kind of shutting the door for further discussion with the external partners.
But if I may stick with you for a moment, Mubashar, in 6 years since Rana Plaza, the government has had time to discuss this out, hasn't it, with these international brands, etc. Why hasn't it made more progress to a level that would satisfy it as well?
This is, third world countries' government like Bangladesh or in Pakistan or in India, it's not as efficient in many places comparing to the developing countries. There are a lot of bureaucracies, there are a lot of interest groups, and politicians are engaged in business too, businessmen are engaged in politics too. So the opinion and the policy decision makers are cumbersome process. So you really can't say that 6 years is enough or 6 years is not enough, because this has not been proven anywhere that 6 years has been enough to be a government for self-sufficiently impose the safety standard in the garment sector. Because Bangladesh, if you look into the Bangladeshi sector, it's quite haphazard. It's lot of things are happening within and beyond the legal mechanism, like other developing countries. So I think that we can't really say it's really 6 years is enough.
Okay.
But my point is that government should not shut down the door for discussion to external partners. The garment industry is kind of the blood in a kind of the main source of foreign exchange, foreign currency in the country.
Okay.
So it would be a setback for the government. So it should act.
Sure. Okay, I wanted to get a reaction to that from Aruna. Aruna, what do you make of? You think that the government has been doing enough? Because if we're talking about bureaucracies or whatever, and pressure on garment factories, I imagine that argument can be made for even the developed world, Aruna, to an extent where everyone would want costs to be down, obviously, but it's about regulation, as you said, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean I think obviously the government hasn't done enough, and I think one of the starting points of the question is, what are happening to factories that are declared unsafe by the two private initiatives that were there in the industry, and what can governments do? And just to take this away from Bangladesh as well, I think this is not a problem only for Bangladesh. I think fire and building safety concerns are considerable concerns in other countries as well.
Let me go to Ben for a moment. Ben, one of the major issues here, obviously, and I believe we spoke about this last time, we brought up this topic with you as well, was that of consumer awareness. Because all of this goes back to that, doesn't it? If the consumer is more aware of what's happening and how their jeans or their clothes are being made, they would make smarter choices, wouldn't they, Ben?
Yes, I think the awareness of consumers has grown over the last years because there has been so much considerable attention to labor rights conditions and safety in the workplaces in the garment sector. So awareness has risen, but at the same time, consumers only have that much power. In the end, we do believe that consumers do want to have nice clothes that they like and that fit their personality, but at the same time also aspire that those clothes are not necessarily made in bad conditions or in unsafe factories. So we feel that there is a demand from the consumers to have safe factories. And obviously, brands are responsive to that. So in that sense, it is in the brand's interests to also have a functioning initiative such as the Accord to be able to say to consumers and to guarantee to consumers, yes, we are actually part of the solution in fixing factories and making them safer, and to ensure that the clothes that you like from us are made in safe working conditions. So again, this sort of links with why it's necessary at this juncture in time with a government who's not capable in filling that regulatory gap, that there is an initiative that can help also brands reassure consumers that their desire to have nice clothes, which at the same time are made in safe circumstances, is being met.
Okay, so I want to go back to Aruna, who I believe is back on with. Aruna, if you can hear me clearly, I wanted to ask you about the responsibility on consumers' shoulders, because, it's not like all of the clothes that are being made in places like Bangladesh or other garment factories around the world are made for just cheaper brands. They're made for some very expensive brands as well, where consumers can probably afford to pay even more if they need to, if those costs need to be passed down to them. Do you think there's a little bit of desensitization on the part of some consumers, especially in the West, about how their garments are even made?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of need for consumer awareness, but that's increasingly growing. And I think there's data to show that the younger generation of consumers are more conscious and aware of concerns. I mean, the question is, consumers are also seem very impatient. I often get asked the question about, is there a tag that can be attached to clothes that says that, this is ethical? And my answer is no. If you're a conscious consumer, you have to spend 30 minutes of your day reading up on some of these initiatives that are helpful to workers and knowing exactly what you want to look for. So, for example, as a conscious consumer, I would be supportive of the Bangladesh Accord. As a conscious consumer, I would ask brands, have they been ranked by Better Buying, which is a new index that ranks brands and says, how well are you doing on this index? So consumers have to read and want to spend at least 30 minutes and not just look for quick fix solutions like tags and certifications. And that's the one takeaway message for consumers.
Very well. Let me go to Mubashar with that. Mubashar, somebody who's a Bangladeshi academic yourself, I wonder what you make of how important it is for consumers to be aware of how their garments are made, especially those that are made in Bangladesh.
It's vital, and it is important for consumers to be aware about how their clothes are being made, in what condition, because it goes back to the ethics of the trade. But at the same time, this consumer awareness is not disconnected from the growing economic disparity that we are seeing across the world. The more wealth are now being owned by few people than ever. And so consumer can't, product's price would not go, if product's price goes up, in order to maintain the security of the labor. Will consumer buy these products? I don't know. We need to think that in that context, because the whole industry is a global phenomena, even though it is based in Bangladesh, and we're talking about Bangladesh at the moment. More and more people are paying more in rent, saving less in the West, and in Bangladesh as well. So I think we need to ponder upon that when we would talk about that consumer awareness is important. Of course, it is important, but could they afford it? That is the question we need to ponder.
And Ben, I imagine there's a lot of politics at play here too, isn't it? These brands and economics, a mixture of both, really. These brands could easily just move to another country, couldn't they? Which would give them a cheaper deal. And that would obviously hurt the economy of a country like Bangladesh, which for quite a large extent depends on these garment factories to continue churning out these garments. How does one break that cycle? We've spoken about a global compact of some sort, but is that really reasonable? Is that really realistic at this time?
Well, yeah, we believe indeed that a cut and run option is not acceptable from a moral or a human rights perspective. So whenever we engage with brands, our imperative is actually that brands should stay where they are and actually start helping to fix things, rather than once there is a problem just move away and go to the next country or factory and wait until new problems arise. So we think that the solution is indeed to start also regulating brands and making them actually responsible for legally responsible for identifying and stopping and mitigating human rights risks in their supply chains, so that once they establish a relationship, are not only just a client in terms of consuming and buying goods, but once that there are human rights violations, when there's human rights risks, when there are safety risks, that they also become part of making sure that solutions that are meaningful to those risks are happening.
Okay, we'll leave that as our final word. The clock has gotten the best of us. Appreciate, of course, all of your time, your insight, and analysis. Our esteemed guests joining us were Ben Vanpeperstraete, who is Lobby and Advocacy Coordinator with the Clean Clothes Campaign. He was speaking to us from Brussels via Skype. We were joined by Dr. Mubashar Hasan, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at Oslo University. He was joining us from the Norwegian capital via Skype. And we were also joined on the line from India by Ms. Aruna Kashyap, who is a lawyer, and she works as Senior Counsel for the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, and she's worked excessively on the rights of garment workers in many countries across Asia. And now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, the aspect of economics is an important one here. And obviously, it's easy to blame the Bangladesh government solely. And of course, it does have some responsibility when it comes to maintaining this Bangladesh Accord, which many people would argue has made the conditions for garment workers in that country better. But brands also haven't been taking their share of the burden, haven't been paying out the costs that have been passed on now to the factories. So all of that needs to be balanced out. Is the consumer aware enough? Are brands doing enough? Is the government doing enough? Are governments around the world doing enough? All of those issues, complex web, but is it really being resolved? We'll keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. But thanks for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi.